welcome to Decoding the Digital Lab with CSols. It's a podcast that explores the potential of laboratory informatics. Today's episode will uncover and deep dive into the various hosting models, on-prem versus cloud versus software as a service, but we'll focus on the human layer. And with us today to discuss this is Dennis Whitman, a colleague of mine, but also a senior technical consultant here at CSols, who does a lot of work with clients on implementing hosting models. So welcome, Dennis. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I want you to get us started. You did a great job with the webinar. That's why I asked you to join our podcast. You did a great job with the webinar discussing the technical details and decision considerations around hosting models. But what I want to focus on in this 10 or 15 minutes is really around the human layer of those models, right? Is the decision of collaboration and kind of day-to-day use a factor in choosing the hosting model or not? How does that collaborative need play in?
Well, I've been working with different LIMS in the 3 hosting models for about a dozen years, and the biggest difference that we can have for success is the stakeholders. The stakeholder is gonna make all the difference in whether or not the project succeeds, but your choice of hosting model is kinda dependent on who's going to be using the system, who your stakeholders are, how your scientists like to work, what kind of administrators you want, all these human factors. And then adoption is a big part of it. If you roll out something that is not going to work for your particular stakeholders, what was the point? So the human factor is huge in this. And the hosting model, there's so many differences between the different hosting models as well as similarities that it really is very wise to take a careful examination of the human layer.
And so give us an example, like dig in a little bit deeper. Like give me an example of, let's
Sure.
say, software as a service versus cloud, and what that human experience would be. How would it differ, for example? Or you could choose on-prem versus cloud, whatever you want, but maybe a little bit of an example for our listeners.
Sure. Let's say you had a kind of a small lab and you had some scientists and you had some technical people to work as administrators, IT people, but it was a small team and you went with on-prem. Well, you might have very fast turnaround times. You might all be in the same room. So when you need to restart the server, boom, hey, Bob, restart the server. Now, on a SaaS solution, if something goes wrong, you might have to contact the vendor and get them to restart, which is fine. They're very responsive, but at the same time, it's kind of a completely different experience. So that's part of it. Now, on the other hand, I would say that when it's all implemented correctly for most of your users, they might not really notice the difference at all.
Okay.
Mhm.
So the human layer that you're referring to really focuses on the sort of configuration, operability of the system, and the sort of the empowerment of the users. Is that really kind of the focus of where you were heading?
Exactly right. Yes. When you think about a cloud or an on prem system, you have so much more control over the configuration and even customization that's going to be a very different experience, even all the way down to your SMEs. Perhaps they'll be able to work very closely with experts all the time, that are on staff or from a consultancy that's going to stick around for a while. And they can work with them to customize and configure the system. Whereas with SaaS, you're much more limited. You should be working with the vendor to do a lot of those customizations. So there is a difference in the experience.
Is there also one thing that sort of comes to mind when you're talking? Because it's really around that setup, that config, that customization, and being able to do what you want when. And that's all super important. Is there sort of a collaborative or a data accessibility value that any of the hosting models would provide over one or the other, right?
One thing that I would say is a big factor in all of this lately is no code solutions or low code solutions, where what we do is we
Are they
give
real, Dennis?
they are real. Yeah, they're very real. And as a programmer, believe it or not, I love them because when a scientist sits down and designs a workflow visually, a process in LIMS to get a sample tested and get it through its life cycle or whatever they're trying to do, when they click save, they do it in a format that I can understand. It's not a big PDF with a bunch of instructions. It's not an email telling me what they want to do. They've done it already, but I can understand it. The system can understand it. Many consultancies can understand what they've done. And think about it. If you've been in LIMS for a while, if you've been in software for a while, you know one of the biggest challenges, the biggest time sink is translating things from what a person wants to what a machine can understand. But these no code solutions already allow you to do that. Now, the reason that comes in with these hosting models is because all the LIMS have, or I won't say all, but almost all of the LIMS have been trying to bring in no code and low code systems. And one of the reasons was because it works better with SaaS. Because you have this limited control with SaaS, and let me just back up just briefly and say with SaaS, you're sharing a system with other clients, parts of it. You're sharing the program, but not the data, right? So you are limited in what you can do in terms of configuration and especially customization. So these no code solutions give you a way to do that. So you don't have to have these layers of translation between your scientist, your IT administrator, your developer, and all these people because you just let your scientists go onto your dev server in a safe place and you let them try to develop a process after a couple weeks of training and what they deliver is as good as I could do.
And so when we speak of collaboration and kind of data accessibility and searchability, do any of them provide more of that value kind of as a strategic advantage for an organization? Or is it really primarily focused on the human aspects of skill set need, resource development, empowerment of rapid change, especially for an R&D environment?
Mhm, yeah.
Could you speak a little bit to maybe the usability versus the configurability of the system?
So I would put it this way, with your SaaS solutions, as we keep saying, you are somewhat limited, but you do have things like no code solutions. Um, it's really more of a human factor in terms of things like searchability. Um, Perhaps with on-prem or, cloud, you might have some more searchability options that you could implement faster. So when you mentioned the speed of doing things, let's say that you wanted to hook up Power BI or Spotfire to your LIMS, right? Well, if you're on-prem or cloud, that might be a lot easier, right? You have control over that database. If you're SaaS, you're gonna have to go through the vendor, and they're gonna either have to work with you to use your existing interface that maybe you've already had designed, or they're gonna have to punch a new hole through, right, to your database, and that's gonna come with cost and especially time.
So are your courses somewhat vendor locked if they go the SaaS route? Or does the gain of empowerment kind of outweigh that?
The vendors work with the clients so well on getting a tailored solution. You know, there is such a thing as an out of the box SaaS, but very few people are going to use that except initially because they're going to quickly realize that they want more things out of the SaaS. So, yeah, there's a little bit of vendor lock in with SaaS where if you want that integration from your adjacent system, you're going to have to talk to that SaaS vendor and it's up to them, you know, that they could say, "No, we can't do that." I doubt they ever would. But if it's in your organization with cloud or on-prem, well, then if you've got the authority to ask for that, then they'll do it, you know? They'll figure out a way to do it. Good SaaS solutions, it's pretty transparent though. You know, your IT folks, if you're the PM or if you're the Scrum Master or somebody like that, you might not notice that much of a difference if your IT administrator or your person in that role to communicate with the SaaS vendor is really working hand in hand. Should be pretty transparent. I don't see why it would have much more of an overhead than any organization's layers of IT do.
So it sounds like when a lab is deciding where to head, the usability factor is less of a concern with the hosting model options in terms of accessing the data, using the functionality. And where the real power of the decision consideration for a lab starts is around once the system is in, how can that system easily evolve? Right? Do I need specialists?
Exactly.
Do I need IT folks? Do I need a long turnaround time for changes to be made? How much control? And so it really, if you could speak a little bit to the adaptability and flexibility needs, or from your perspective, even better, where should a lab start? Like how involved should they be with that decision, or should they really defer it to kind of the infrastructure teams as long as they can do their work as they need to?
Well, let's look at one facet to answer your question, and that would be instrument integrations and instrument software. So let's say the lab, if they know their forecast or what they have already, if they have a ton of different kinds of instruments and they don't have any plan to run them through middleware or something like that, then think about it. That's going to be 10, 20 different integrations between these instruments and limbs. Now, if you're on SaaS, you're going to be going to the vendor and asking for 20 different holes through the firewall, 20 different integrations, 20 different adoptions. But if you're on-prem or cloud, well, that's not as big of a deal. They've already probably figured out the route and you just put in for it and they can hook up the next instruments, whether they're in that same lab or another lab, you can network the labs. All that kind of stuff is just going to go a little bit easier in my experience. Now, again, a good SaaS vendor should make that pretty transparent. But that's one example of if you had a few instruments, then maybe it's fine to go with SaaS. Let's say you're only envisioning one connection, or you're using a middleware already, or you're going to use a middleware, so you only need one connection to the SaaS. Then you're over on the inside of your VPC or your network, and you're able to hook up those instruments, as many as you want to your middleware, and your middleware is already connected to LIMS, and the rest of it's just configuration that would be the same in SaaS or any version.
So if I'm a lab manager and IT comes to me and says, we're considering one of the three models, what's the key question I should ask them to make sure I get my needs met?
Well, they should be asking you questions, but what I would say is, let me answer it this way. With SaaS, a lot of folks want to start out small, and that's great about SaaS. You can start out small, you're making less of a commitment, you can back out easier. So I would ask IT, how well do you work with SaaS vendors? If they express that they don't like working with SaaS vendors, that they've had issues with a lot of SaaS vendors, then at least you're going to have a lot of extra work with SaaS. If your IT folks don't like your solution, you're going to have to do a lot of extra work.
Okay. So it's really more of an organizational obstacle that could occur and much less of a choice that they make in the infrastructure side would significantly affect my scientists' ability to do their work.
One thing I would point out is that we're actually seeing some of the limbs are actually diverging between the SaaS version and the on-prem slash cloud version. So that might be another consideration to think about. If you're going to jump into a certain limbs, look and ask them, are they going to diverge? Are they going to branch off and have two different versions?
And by diverge, do you mean offer the two or eventually fade one out?
They haven't said, but my suspicion would be they would like to phase out cloud and on-prem as much as possible, but they know it's not possible.
Okay, Dennis, it looks like we're nearing the end of time. So I'm going to ask you to just leave our listeners with one last thought from you. What is that last piece of advice that would pull kind of our conversation together for them?
Sure. When we think about the human layer, your users aren't going to really care about what hosting model you're using if it's all going well. So you need to think about the things we talked about, the different differences between what it's going to be like with your different support layers and everything else, and make your decision based on that. So it's really about how much you're going to empower your users, what your users like to do. Are they no code solution kind of folks, or are they out of the box limbs kind of folks? Take those into account and just try to think about what we've said in terms of forecasting what the experience is going to be like for them. And that should help you pick the best solution.
Thanks, Dennis. I think that's a great way to really focus on the empowerment of the users and the ability for them to be agile and flexible to do their work when they need to do it. Without a lot of obstacles. So thanks very much, everyone. That's all the time we have today. We really appreciate you joining today's episode of Decoding the Digital Lab with CSols. I do encourage you to listen to Dennis's webinar. He does do a bit more of a technical deep dive. Today we focused on the human layer, but if you're interested in the technical aspects, I would encourage you to listen to it. And you can find the link to this episode in Spotify and YouTube. Thanks so much.